The bridge didn't make a sound when it went. That's what Earl Braddock remembers most. No crack, no groan, no warning shot fired across the belly of the steel. Just the sound of harvest, the combine running, the radio low, the grain cart rattling behind the tractor on County Road 1400 North, and then a void where the road used to be. October 14th, 2023, 7:42 in the evening. Earl was running his S68 through the last pass on the Hennessy ground, 240 acres of corn on the east side of Sangamon Creek, when the call came over the two-way from Nathan. His son's voice was flat, controlled. The kind of flat that means something very bad has happened, and the person telling you about it is still deciding whether to believe it themselves. Dad, the 1400 bridge is gone. Earl shut down the header, pulled the combine out of gear, sat in the cab with the engine idling and the dust settling against the glass, and asked his son to say that again. The bridge over Sangamon Creek. It collapsed. Gary Phelps was crossing with a loaded grain cart, and the whole east span dropped into the creek. The cart's in the water. Gary's truck is hanging off the west abutment by the rear axle. Earl didn't say anything for a long time. He sat in that cab and looked out through the windshield at 400 acres of standing corn on the wrong side of a creek that no longer had a crossing. He could feel it in his chest before his brain caught up. That cold, sinking feeling that starts below your ribs and spreads outward until your hands go still on the armrests. He'd felt it twice before in his life. Once when the bank called about the 2009 note, and once when his father's heart monitor went flat in the ICU at Carl. It's the feeling of something you cannot fix and cannot outrun. And it was sitting in that cab with him now, filling up the space between the glass and the seat, like water rising in a basement. Nathan was still on the radio. "Dad, you there?" "I'm here," Earl said. And then he said the only thing a farmer can say when the world falls out from under him is, "Everybody okay?" Everybody was okay, for now. But okay was about to become a very relative term in Ford County. The Sangamon Creek Bridge on County Road 1400 North had been the only direct route between the East Side farms and the grain elevator at Anchor for 46 years. 23 operations used that bridge during harvest. Every bushel of corn and every bushel of beans grown east of the creek crossed those steel I-beams on the way to market. There was no other route. The next crossing was 14 miles south at the state highway, which added 28 miles round trip to every load, through 2 school zones, past a hospital, and over a weight-restricted municipal bridge that couldn't legally carry a loaded semi. Earl had known the bridge was failing. Everyone had. The concrete deck had been spalling for 5 years. The east abutment had a visible crack that grew wider every spring. The steel beams were rusted through in 3 places you could see from the road, and God knows how many you couldn't. Earl himself had gone to the county board meeting in March of 2021 and told Carl Dreher, the county highway superintendent, that the bridge needed to be replaced before someone got killed. Dreher had looked at Earl over those wire rim bifocals and said the county didn't have the budget. Said the bridge was rated for legal loads. Said Earl was welcome to file a formal complaint if he wanted to generate paperwork that wouldn't change anything. Earl went back in 2022. Same meeting, same room, same answer. Dreher said the bridge had been inspected and rated functionally obsolete, which in county highway language meant it was old, but not condemned. It meant the county acknowledged it was failing, but wasn't required to close it. It meant they could watch it die and call it maintenance. If you want to hear something that'll make your blood pressure rise, listen to this. Earl pulled the inspection reports through a Freedom of Information request that winter. The bridge had been flagged for structural deficiency in 2019. The east span had lost 40% of its load capacity. The engineering firm that did the inspection recommended immediate weight restrictions and a replacement timeline of 18 months. Dreer's office received that report, filed it, and did nothing. Not a single orange cone. Not a single weight limit sign. Nothing. And now, Gary Phelps was sitting in a truck cab, hanging over a creek bed, with 40,000 pounds of corn in the water below him, and the entire east side of Ford County was cut off from its elevator with 6,000 acres of corn still standing and a weather window that was closing by the day. Gary was fine, shaken, bruised where the seatbelt caught him, but fine. The volunteer fire department pulled him out within an hour. His truck wasn't fine. The grain cart wasn't fine. And the 420 bushels of corn in that cart were sitting in Sangamon Creek, turning to mush. But that was one man's loss. What happened next was 23 families' catastrophe. If you're not a farmer, let me explain what October means in central Illinois. October is the month. It's the whole year compressed into 30 days. Every dollar you spent on seed, fertilizer, diesel, crop insurance, land rent, equipment payments. Every dime of it is standing in the field, waiting to be converted from plant to cash. You don't harvest in October, you don't eat in January. It's that simple. And harvest doesn't wait. The corn is ready when it's ready. The beans are ready when they're ready. And the weather doesn't care about your bridge. Earl sat at the kitchen table that night with Ruth and Nathan, and a county map spread out between the coffee cups. Ruth had already called the insurance company. The answer was what Earl expected. Crop insurance covers weather, covers disease, covers price collapse. It does not cover infrastructure failure. If your corn rots in the field because the county let a bridge fall down, that's between you and the county. Good luck with that lawsuit. It'll be resolved right around the time your grandchildren graduate college. The math was brutal. 23 farms, 6,200 acres of corn and soybeans still unharvested on the east side. Average yield of 212 bushels per acre on the corn, 54 on the beans. At October 2023 prices, that was roughly $1.2 million worth of grain, sitting in fields that now had no way to reach a scale. Some of the younger farmers started talking about the 14-mile detour through town, running grain semis, through the school zone, past the hospital, and over the municipal bridge. Nathan looked into it that night, called the town clerk, called the county sheriff. The municipal bridge was posted at 20 tons. A loaded grain truck weighs 40. If you crossed it and got caught, that was a $2,500 fine per crossing, and your CDL was at risk. If you crossed it and it held, you were lucky. If you crossed it and it didn't hold, you were the next headline. People in town thought it was funny. Earl heard about it the next morning at the co-op. 2 retired guys at the counter, laughing about the East Side farmers and their bridge problem. One of them said something about how those boys should have built their own bridge years ago, if they were so worried about it. The other one said maybe they should haul their corn out with wheelbarrows. They were still laughing when Earl paid for his diesel and walked out without a word. Here's what people who laugh at farmers don't understand. A farmer will take every joke, absorb every insult, swallow every humiliation, and then go home and solve the problem anyway. That's what separates the people who grow the food from the people who eat it and complain about the price. Earl drove home that morning and sat in his truck in the driveway for 10 minutes before he went inside. Ruth saw him through the kitchen window. She told Nathan later that she almost went out to him, but she didn't. She knew that look. She'd been married to it for 34 years. That was the look Earl got when he was converting pain into a plan. You don't interrupt that. You just make sure there's coffee on when he comes through the door. What people also don't understand is what it feels like to stand in a field and know that everything you planted, everything you sprayed, everything you scouted and worried over and prayed about for 6 months is ready. The corn is at 15% moisture. The stalks are standing. The weather is holding, and you cannot reach it. It's like watching your house burn from across a river with no bridge, which is exactly what it was. Earl had $418,000 worth of corn standing on his east side ground alone, 440 acres at $2.12 an acre at $4.48 a bushel. That wasn't profit. That was gross. Out of that came the seed bill, the fertilizer bill, the diesel, the crop insurance premium, the land rent on the Hennessy quarter, and the payment on the S-68. Oh, that was sitting idle in the field. If that corn didn't make it to the elevator, Earl wasn't just losing a paycheck. He was losing the ability to plant next year, and the year after that. One season's failure doesn't kill a farm, but it starts the clock. Wade Terschlusse called Earl at 6 the next morning. Wade farmed 2,200 acres north of Earl, also east of the creek, also cut off. Wade had been up all night. He'd been on the phone with every farmer east of Sangamon Creek, and he'd been on the phone with a buddy who ran a gravel company out of Bloomington. Earl, I got an idea. It's not cheap and it's not pretty, but it might work. Wade's idea was this. There was a section of Sangamon Creek, about 2 miles south of the collapsed bridge, where the creek narrowed to 40 feet, and the banks were solid limestone on both sides. If they could get a temporary crossing in there, not a bridge, just a reinforced culvert crossing with enough fill to handle loaded trucks, they could cut a half-mile field road connecting to County Road 1,200 north and have a route to the elevator that bypassed the collapsed bridge entirely. The cost estimate was $87,000. 48-inch culvert pipe, 700 tons of gravel, fill dirt, a dozer, an excavator, and someone who knew how to set a crossing that wouldn't wash out the first time the creek rose. $87,000, split 23 ways. That was $3,783 per farm. Earl could manage that. Most of the bigger operations could manage that. But there were 4 or 5 smaller farms on the east side, guys running 300, 400 acres, for whom $4,000 in October was the difference between making the land payment and not making the land payment. Wade didn't hesitate. He proposed a weighted split. Farms over 1,000 acres paid a larger share. Farms under 500 paid a reduced share. The 5 biggest operations, including Earl's and Wade's, would cover the difference. Earl agreed before Wade finished the sentence. They held the meeting that night in Wade's machine shed. 23 farmers, Every single one showed up. Earl stood against the wall and watched Wade lay out the plan on a whiteboard. The cost, the timeline, the weighted split. The fact that they had maybe 10 days before the weather turned and the corn started falling over in the field. Not one farmer said no. Not one. There was some discussion about the route. There was some discussion about liability. Whose land the field road would cross, who was responsible if something went wrong. But on the central question, are we doing this? There was no debate. Earl watched 23 men sign a handwritten agreement on a piece of yellow legal pad paper, pledging their share of the cost. And he thought about his father, Walter, who always said, the only thing that separates a community from a collection of strangers is whether they show up when it costs them something. If you're enjoying this story, take a second to subscribe. It helps this channel keep telling the stories that the people on your screen would never tell about themselves. The work started at dawn the next morning. Wade's buddy from Bloomington brought the culvert pipe on 2 flatbeds. Earl's neighbor, Dennis Pruitt, donated the use of his Cat D 6 dozer. Virgil Kemp, 71 years old, drove his service truck out to the site and spent 3 days keeping equipment running that had no business running as hard as they were pushing it. The first day was the hardest, not because of the work. The work was straightforward. It was hard because nobody knew if it would hold. They were building a road across a creek based on a plan drawn on a whiteboard by a man who'd never built a crossing before, using culvert pipe sourced from a buddy's gravel company, on a timeline that didn't allow for mistakes. Earl stood on the bank that first morning and watched the excavator lower the first section of pipe into the creek bed and felt every dollar of his share of $87,000 settle into his stomach like cold ballast. If this didn't work, they hadn't just lost the money, they'd lost the time. And time was the one thing they couldn't buy back. But it did work. The pipe set clean against the limestone, the gravel packed solid, and by the end of day 1, they had a foundation that looked like it might actually carry a truck. They built that crossing in 4 days, 4 days of 16-hour shifts. Farmers running equipment they'd never operated before. Nathan Braddock spent an entire day in an excavator bucket setting culvert pipe in knee-deep creek water. Ruth Braddock and 3 other wives ran a food operation out of the back of 2 pickup trucks. Sandwiches, thermoses of coffee, water jugs, feeding 30 men from sunup to sundown. And the whole time they were building, the town was watching. Carl Dreher drove out on the second day in his white county Silverado, stood on the bank with his arms crossed, and told Wade that the crossing might not meet county specifications. Wade looked at him and said, "Carl, your bridge didn't meet county specifications either, and it killed itself. You want to write me a ticket, but get off my work site." Dreher left. He didn't come back. The crossing was finished on October 19th. It wasn't pretty. It was gravel and culvert pipe and filled dirt packed down by a dozer and rolled by a water truck. But it held. The first loaded grain truck crossed it at 7:15 in the morning. Gary Phelps driving, because Wade insisted on it. Gary had lost his truck, his grain cart, and 400 bushels of corn to that creek. He was going to be the first man to cross back over it. The truck held. The crossing held. Gary made it to the elevator, dumped his load, and drove back. And then the floodgates opened. There's a moment in farming that you can't explain to someone who hasn't lived it. It's the moment when the grain hits the scale and the ticket prints, and you know, not hope, not believe, but know that what you grew is going to make it to market. That the year wasn't for nothing. That the seed you put in the ground in April, and the diesel you burned in May, and the sleepless nights in July when the rain wouldn't come, and the prayers in August when it wouldn't stop. All of it added up to a number on a yellow ticket at the elevator window. Gary Phelps held that ticket in his hand on the morning of October 19th, and his hands were shaking, not from cold, from relief, from the weight of 6 days of not knowing whether it was gonna work, finally lifting off his shoulders like a physical thing. He drove back to the crossing and parked at the east approach and got out of his truck and just stood there for a minute, looking at what they'd built, gravel and pipe and limestone and sweat. It wasn't a bridge. It was an act of refusal. 23 men refusing to accept that their season was over because the county couldn't maintain a piece of steel that had been failing in front of their eyes for 5 years. For the next 11 days, 23 farms ran harvest through that crossing. Earl ran his S68 018 hours a day. Nathan drove grain cart to semi to elevator, elevator back to field, over and over and over, crossing that culvert bridge 40 times a day. The crossing took a beating. Virgil spent every evening grading the approaches with a box blade behind Earl's 4440, keeping the gravel surface passable. On the third night, Earl found Nathan sitting on the tailgate of his Colorado at the crossing site, alone, in the dark. The boy had been in the creek since 6 a.m. His boots were soaked through. His hands were raw from guiding pipe. Earl sat down beside him, and neither of them said anything for a while. Then Nathan said, "Grandpa would have been out here." Earl nodded. "He would have been the first one in the water," Earl said. Nathan looked at him. "So were you." Earl didn't answer that. He just put his hand on his son's shoulder and squeezed once, and they sat there listening to the creek run through the pipes they'd laid that morning. They lost 2 days to rain on October 24th and 25th. The creek rose 18 inches. The crossing held, but nobody could run a combine in a muddy field, so they waited. Earl sat in his shop and watched the radar on his phone and didn't sleep. Here's the number that matters. On November 1st, the last combine on the east side, Wade Terschlus's S790, pulled out of the last field and shut down. Every bushel was out. 6,200 acres, every farm, every bean, every ear of corn, all of it across that gravel crossing and into the elevator before the first hard freeze on November 3rd. If you're still watching, hit subscribe and the bell. These stories don't get told anywhere else. $1.2 million in grain, exposed, vulnerable, written off by the insurance company and abandoned by the county that was supposed to maintain the infrastructure. And 23 farmers, most of whom would never talk about what they did, built their own way across and saved every bushel. The county eventually replaced the 1,400 North Bridge. It took 14 months. The new bridge opened in December 2024 and cost $1.4 million in state and federal funds. The engineering report for the new bridge referenced the 2019 inspection that recommended replacement. Carl Dreyer retired 3 months before the report was published. He moved to a condo in Peoria. The temporary crossing is still there. The county never formally approved it and never formally condemned it. It sits at the narrow point of Sangamon Creek, with the culvert pipes still flowing clean and the gravel still packed hard. Local farmers use it as a shortcut during planting and harvest. Nobody maintains it officially. Virgil Kemp grades it twice a year with his box blade and doesn't send a bill. Earl drives over it sometimes on his way to check the east fields. He doesn't slow down. He doesn't think about it. It's just a crossing. But if you asked him, if you sat him down and put a cup of coffee in front of him and asked him what it meant, he'd probably sit there for a long time. And then he'd say something about how the bridge didn't make a sound when it went. How the creek just swallowed it like it was nothing. And how 23 men who owed each other nothing except the accident of farming on the same side of the same water decided in 4 days to build something the county couldn't build in 14 months. He wouldn't call it heroic. He'd call it harvest